Good morning, everyone. So today's session is talk about democracy. Before I start my session, I'm reminded of an interesting mock fight which used to happen between two students in 1987. One was, his name was Muttassim. He was a student from Sudan, and he had taken political science in his final year, and he used to have an argument with his friend who had taken sociology. And Muttassim used to tell the student who had taken sociology, why do you want to go for lectures? Go to your grandmother. She will tell you everything about society. So don't waste your time. And the sociology student used to say, why do you want to attend lectures? You can read newspapers, and that will give you enough understanding about politics. So this is one concern which I often have, that a lot of our understanding of politics comes from popular sources, popular understanding, and not a real in-depth understanding of political concepts, ideas. And that's something which I thought I will address before I look at the Indian challenge. So therefore, we will look at some writers, ideas before we go into looking at the Indian concept, because one of the things which discourses, he's also looking at something called a republican form of government, right from the time of Roman times. Okay, when you use the word republican, it's not really like today's democracy. Why? Because not everybody participated, but there was a certain section of the population which would also participate in the political process through various mechanisms. And he believed that popular participation was important to balance the power of the rulers and to ensure that there was, some kind of freedom which people had access to. And imagine we're talking about the 15th and 16th century, where the idea of freedom was not really very important. Most political systems were dictatorial. But even at that time, Machiavelli believed that one important value is freedom, uh, to choose, to do what we think is important, whether it's religious or secular. So, one of the important things which democracies try to protect is freedom. The second thinker which I want to look at, uh, of course, in the issue of democracy is Rousseau. Why is Rousseau important? Rousseau is important because he identified two major problems in the democratic process. One, he said that everybody is born, he said, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. What does this mean? He was basically talking about how social and political institutions were created to help human beings. But over of time, they end up oppressing a large section of human beings. And that's something we must be all very concerned about. That social institutions, political institutions can end up doing things which is contrary to what is important for us. The second statement which he said was, he said, the will of the few is often projected as the will of all. So when you say democracy in practice, why is there a crisis of democracy? One of the reasons is this. Often, democracies don't seem to reflect the real concerns of a lot of people. Of course, I can talk about a lot of other thinkers, but that will take a lot of time. And since we don't have much time, I want to go now to a political thinker, which I am quite fascinated by, is a political philosopher called Hannah Arendt. Arendte. Hannah Arendt. She was somebody who wrote in the 1950s and 60s. And one of her very important book is a book called Origins of Totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a form of dictatorial government which tries to cover all areas of human life, not just political. Most dictatorial governments are concerned only with the political, not so much with the economic, cultural, and social. But governments which tend to be totalitarian are try to control everything about human beings. Now, what does Hannah Arendt say? She says the first thing about democracy is that all of us must be vigilant about ensuring free discourse. Okay. One of the things which we need to discuss, which I will discuss today, is the role of dissent. And when we talk about dissent, dissent is a part of free discourse. What is free discourse? There's no restrictions on the nature of my opinion. There's no restriction on the nature of my criticism. Okay. There is no restriction on my ability to question or challenge anybody. The second thing she says is, one of the problems in most societies is that a large number of people fall through the cracks of society. That the political process sometimes tends to ignore significant sections. And these can always become a prey to populist leaders. The challenge for democracy is, one of the biggest expectations from democracy, people expect democracy to be fair to all sections. And when that perception is affected, people may make choices of leaders who may not be democratic, but they project the idea that they would be fair. So when you talk about democracy, we need to ask ourselves the question, is a democracy really fair or seen as being fair? They're two important things. The political process may be fair, but if the perception that it's not fair, that will be the reality of that democratic society. Two marketers, Al Ries and Jack Trout, said, perception is reality. And I want you to understand this, that it's not important governments are corrupt, fair, efficient. How is government managing perceptions about these things? So when you talk about this whole political process, government managing perceptions. Now, one of the problems in democracy, even today when you look at the polarization in society, there has been an increasing rise in resentment. Okay? Anger about the people, that some people are either getting away, or some people are responsible for our problems. And Hannah Arendt identifies one very important case in the late 19th century. After the lecture, please read up about something called the Dreyfus Affair, Dreyfus. The Dreyfus Affair is important because Dreyfus was a French captain who was accused of selling secrets to the Germans. He was arrested and for 12 years he suffered rigorous imprisonment. Then out of 12 years, it was found that he was innocent. But the kind of stigma about Dreyfus and his Jewish identity fed into a lot of emerging anti-Semitism. So when you talk about resentments in society, today in society, who are the people in India against whom there's a lot of hatred and resentment? And where does it lie? How can we correct that? That's one question which we will need to look at. The other problem is a lot of political elites and leaders in democracy sometimes see masses as inconsequential. Large numbers of people, we believe they are not thinking people, and therefore we see them as inconsequential. And therefore when we talk to them, we don't really talk to them in a language they can relate to. We don't seem to be addressing their concerns. So over a period of time, people who talk their language become more popular. People who feed on their insecurities, or people give them narratives which are easy to understand, is something which they will easily accept. Many years ago, when Yogendra Yadav had come to college, he said that a lot of things which we as political elites talk, it's not understandable for ordinary people. He said, there is no word in any Indian language for secular. Secular is separation of politics and religion. The nearest equivalent is Dharma Nirpekshata. Dharma Nirpekshata is maintaining equidistance. It's not about ensuring that religion is not allowed to influence politics, etc. And for India, the word dharma is something which is a holistic look at political process, which includes the religious and all of that. So therefore, our vocabulary sometimes, okay, has never made an attempt to be accessible to ordinary people, because a lot of us are often disdainful. I find often when we use the word masses as ignorant, what I think this whole contempt or patronizing attitude towards the general public is a huge issue and problem which must definitely address, because this is something which I think is extremely important, that we sometimes are not understanding the different components of democracy. The next part is that in the political process, most traditional political elites don't know how to deal with populists. Who are populists? Populists are those who understand popular sentiment, okay, and therefore can uh, relate to them and create a narrative which people appreciate. So populists are those whose ideas may not be economically and politically viable, but they seem as something which is important, necessary, and therefore a lot of people uh, get attracted to populists. But Hannah Arendt says the biggest problem for any democracy is when people begin to disengage with uh, analytical thought in the political process. What's analytical thought? When we're able to actually analyze pros and cons instead of just lapping up what is told to us. A lot of us who are responsible citizens, okay, have disengaged from analytical thought. So a lot of times we are just mouthing what populists say. Okay, we are mouthing what people who want us to believe in a certain way of reality say. So we must ask ourselves this question: how really are we engaging in analytical thinking process? Are we challenging assumptions? Are we challenging certainties? So this analytical process is something which is very important. So it says that disengagement or slow unwillingness to relate, to use analytical process leads to politically useful narratives which are of threats which are dangerous. Okay. So when people say our community is a threat, these are politically useful narratives. And the more these narratives occupy people's imagination, it means that lesser is the use of analytical thinking process. Okay. And a lot of populist narratives also distorts history. Okay. In class, I was talking about in terms of a lot of us, all our history books talk about Islamic invasion. And I mentioned this author called David Eaton. He says if you look at what happened in South America. South America, where the Spanish invaded, and the Spanish used Christianity as a major motive, and they converted a lot of people. But no history book talks about the invasion of Spain as Christian invasion. If you look at modern colonialism, modern imperialism, most of it has been by nations which have professed Christianity. But we call them, whether it's the British or the Dutch or Belgian, we don't call it. Then why do we in India call invasion by the Arabs or the Turks or the Persians as Islamic? Okay. So therefore, when you say history, we create this other of them coming from outside. Therefore, when you look at history, a lot of a textbook talk about Islamic invasion, 13th, 14th, 15th century. But the first mosque in India was 786, or sorry, 686 in Kozhikode. And a lot of it came through trade, Sufis or whatever. So when we're talking about history, what is is the lens through which we are reading history. This is very, very important. Because the terms we use introduce biases into our consciousness. This is extremely important for us to understand. Because, every word is loaded with meanings. And these meanings distort our understanding of reality. And therefore, this distortion of history has been happening in India maybe for 40, 50 years. Even for those of you who are going to study for UPSC, one of the texts which you will study is a book called The Wonder That Was India by Basham. And Basham only looks at India till dominance of rulers from groups which came from Central Asia and West Asia. He does not look at the contribution of sources from outside, including Islamic, which actually nourished thought. So today, if you look at Unani medicine, Unani is Greek, okay, which mixed with Arab, Persian, Central Asian, and Indian ideas to create a branch of medicine. So a lot of times when you look at distortion of history, so our own questioning of history needs to become a little more rigorous. The most important thing for rulers who tend to be dictatorial, their objective is power, not the well-being of the general people, and they don't really attempt to build inclusive communities. They don't really allow for laws which keep governments in check. And therefore, one of the most important things is write laws and what I would call constitutionalism. I want you to write this down if you have a pen and paper. Constitutionalism is more than the Constitution. Constitution is understanding and respecting the Constitution in letter and spirit. The Constitution may allow a lot of things as emergency. Remember, I think 4 lectures ago, or 3 lectures ago, I talked about something called ordinances, where a political executive makes laws. And the Supreme Court called it a fraud on the Constitution. So a lot of times, when you talk about democratic process, is the spirit and letter of the Constitution being fully practiced all the time? This is something which I want us to think about. So let me just summarize the first part in terms of history. Looking at Machiavelli, Rousseau, and Hannah Arendt. These are 3 people. You may want to look at Marx, you may want to look at John Stuart Mill, but these are 3 I have chosen. Okay. I just give you a minute to digest, because I'm going to look at contemporary authors. I'm going to look at 5 contemporary authors and books which look about the threat to democracy. Yeah? Just give a minute to kind of organize, because today is a little heavy in terms of ideas. So if I'm giving you a minute to just go through in your mind the ideas I've talked about. Okay. The first book I want to look at is a book called Democracy Under Threat. Okay. And the author is Ursula, Ursula, Van Peek, Peek. She is a South African scholar. She is in the from the Stellenbosch BOS CH University. Okay. And she heads a center called the Transforming Research Center, or Transformation Research Center. Just look it up. It's an interesting place. And her book is important because she looks at 3 major countries. She looks at South Africa, she looks at Turkey, and she looks at Poland. But she also draws examples from Germany, Sweden, Chile, Taiwan. Okay. And she looks at 2 or 3 important things. One, she looks at how the welfare state is something which emerged in UK, okay, after the Second World War, where it was felt that the state must take care of the needs of the economically most vulnerable and economically weak sections. And over a period of time, the welfare state has become less efficient. And therefore, the state doesn't seem to be taking care of the needs often of the most vulnerable. Second, she also looks at the rise of populist leaders across countries. Actually, even in Europe, you see a lot of rise of populism. The second book which I want you to look at is by an Iranian scholar who works at Georgetown University. His name, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar. Please write it down. Fathali, Moghadeni, Fathali Moghadeni. He's written some very interesting books. One of the books is written called The Psychology of Democracy. He's also written a book called The Psychology of Dictatorship. Okay. He also has written a book called, is possibly his most recent book called Mutual Radicalism. But I also am very interested in his book on the Sage Encyclopedia of Political Behavior. That's something which is edited and written. So that's a book which you can look at. Fathali. So his book is a book called The Threat to Democracy. And the threat to democracy is something he's looking at, again, the various kinds of challenges which comes because the democratic process has become corrupted. It is tending less to the ideal, and therefore there's institutional decay. A lot of authors are talking about the problem of institutional decay. And also with elites, the population at large, and leaders, there's a huge disconnect. So please look at the books of Fathali Moghadeni, because that's something which I think which may give you some insight. The other author I'm going to look at, I'm looking at 2 of his books by a person called Daniel Ziblatt, Daniel Ziblatt. Okay. So the first book of his, which I think is very important, is a book called Challenges to Democracy. And he and other scholars work with a research institute, which is looking at 5 broad areas. The first thing he says that there is extreme partisan polarization in society. He says every society has polarization. So when polarization becomes extreme, what is polarization? When we get divided on grounds of various identities. And these identities can be cultural, ethnic, linguistic, religious, or whatever. So this polarization is in terms of where each one is going to create narratives which are competing, which are challenging, and therefore which cuts into the democratic participation, where identity issues become more important. Second is that how do you sustain multi-ethnic democracies? This is something which is very important for us in India. If I ask you to define who is an Indian, okay, give me the definition of an Indian. Any definition you choose will leave out significant numbers. Today, if you look at the original constitution in English, only there is use of the word official language for both Hindi and English. Today, when we use the word national language, okay, and we identify national language as Hindi, it leaves out about 60% of the population who may not be Hindi speaking. But a lot of our political elites right from the freedom struggle, have come from the North. So they identify with that dimension. Therefore, in terms of when you say it's a multicultural identity, so recently when India was promoting the use of Hindi as one of the languages in the UN, because it represents the people of India, people from many states of India protested. They said Hindi does not represent all of us. So in a multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy, how do you manage them? So Hindi, if you look at religion, if you look at language, ethnicity. One of the major problems for a lot of us, we're not really familiar with ethnicities beyond what we call the peninsular India. So therefore, those are things which we need to understand in terms of how do we sustain multi-ethnic democracies. So what is the role of young people like all of you here of getting back to sustaining this multi-ethnic democracy? The other is in terms of how do you manage economic inequalities? Okay. How do you ensure that economic inequalities do not lead democratic discontent? This is a very important thing. How do you ensure that economic inequality does not lead to democratic discontent? In a lot of places, okay, if you look at vulnerable sections, we're choosing particular political parties because most others have not addressed their economic inequality, their concerns, and democratic discontent emerges out of that. The fourth thing is the pursuit of populism. Those of you who are students of political science, when I do Indian political process, I talk about something called competitive populism. And what is competitive populism? Where political parties, okay, seek support on the basis of caste, language, religion, ethnicity. So all political parties are guilty of engaging in competitive populism. And for India, people say competitive populism began in 1967. So we are dealing with a legacy, okay, of more than 50 years. Okay. So that's something which is, so therefore populism is not something which is in the last 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, 20 years. From 67, okay, this is something which has been happening. And the last thing which they talk about is what is called the crisis of institutions. What is the crisis of institutions? When institutions, whether you look at the judiciary, yesterday we talk about the press as an institution. If you look at elections as an institution, election commission as an institution, if you look at parliament as an institution, all these institutions are going through crisis, where there's expectation of fairness, even-handedness, a lot of it is possibly being sacrificed. The other book, which I think some of you may be familiar, is a book edited by Indian sociologist who has done a lot of work with London School of Economics. His name is Surendra Munshi. The book is also called Democracy Under Threat. And that book is interesting because it is a collected essays of 20 scholars. And it looks at right from issues of democracy and human rights. It also talks about the crisis of leadership. A lot of politicians don't seem to have a statesman-like leadership. It also talks about fragility of institutions. I talked about this whole crisis of institutions. They talk about fragility of institutions. They talk about growing authoritarianism. And they also said there is a failure of broad-based political values. And there's something they call declining declining political efficacy. Political efficacy is in terms of broad-ranging political awareness, what Hannah Arendt talked about as analytical thinking. All of that, there is significant decline. And also one of the things they look at is how, when you look at economic crisis often lead to what is called tightening of the belt. What is tightening of the belt? Where you need to cut down on budget deficits. And the so-called tightening of economic spending often affects spending on the poor. So whether there is a cut down of resources for NREGA, health, education. So if you look at all these percentages have come down in the last 30 years. So therefore, that's one concern in terms of the issue of economic crisis. And the last book which I want us to look at is a book called How Democracies Die. And this is a book which is co-authored by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. I've already introduced you to Daniel Ziblatt. So basically, they're also looking at earlier works by a person called Juan Linz. Please take down the name, Juan Linz. So Juan Linz looks at this whole issue of abnormalities and dangers in politics, and how certain abnormalities become a part of the new normal. So therefore, that is something they looked at. And they say this book is important because they say that in addition to the constitution, every political system must have uh, unwritten laws, informal rules, and the spirit of law. And this is what I mentioned, constitutionalism. So good democratic conventions, okay, in terms of including. So that's something which is very important. I don't know how many of you remember in 1993 when Narasimha Rao was Prime Minister. Okay? There was this major crisis in the UN Human Rights Commission, where Pakistan had tabled a motion to criticize human rights abuses by India, especially in Kashmir. And at that time, the Indian delegation was led by an important leader of the opposition, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And therefore, when you say democratic politics, can you practice politics which includes people from other, political affiliation, interests, so that we can build consensus? Okay? That is something which is extremely important, because when we talk about this whole thing about unwritten rules, when you saw decency in politics, there's a very interesting thing you must read. Vajpayee's statement when Rajiv Gandhi died. He said, "What can I say of a man who saved my life?" He said there was a international thing. He made me go as a part of a delegation, and he also said, "Please get your kidney ailment treated," because that was only possible at that time in the US. So when you talk about decency in politics, it can be practiced by all political parties and leaders. But sometimes that becomes lacking when it becomes extremely confrontational. So these are books which I thought, which one says, and also they talk about a very interesting concept. They talk about collective abdication. What is abdication? Where people give up their responsibility to sustain democracy. So it can happen by institutions, by members of the political elite, and a lot of other people. So when we talk about India, I would also look at this issue of political abdication. So when you talk about Indian democracy, I want all of you to spend time with, after the lecture, with the preamble. Okay? Because the preamble encapsulates the philosophy of the Constitution. And in the preamble, look at the three objectives of the Indian political system. And the first objective is justice, economic and social justice. Okay. Look at where have we failed vulnerable sections in terms of access to justice. The second objective is liberty. Are we able to protect the liberty of contrarian voices? Are we able to protect the liberty of vulnerable communities? Okay. So when you say, and are we able to protect the voices of contrarian, are we able to protect the liberty of contrarian voices? And the third objective is equality. How have we managed inequality? Absolute equality is not possible. Have we worked towards reducing inequality? Can we manage inequality better so that the weaker sections do not really suffer? As I said earlier, now India has one of the largest number of malnutrition people, which is going to get worse because of this continued lockdown and a lot of other issues. And there is a fourth objective, which most of us, I'm sure, are not familiar with. And that's the objective of fraternity. What is fraternity? A sense of community, okay? A sense of, what should I say, where everybody is a part of a single humanity. And our political system possibly has failed in all these objectives. And that failure is not just about the system, it's a failure of all of us. And that's where, as I said, can we reimagine ourselves? I think in my early lectures I talked about Manuel Castells. Is it possible for us to reprogram ourselves in terms of political ideas, political practice, political values? Okay. Therefore, it's a call to all of us in terms of how do we reach out? How do you inject this dimension into political discourse? That, I think, is very important. Of course, we have also discussed a lot about institutions in my earlier lectures, so I will not take so much time. But I want all of us to look at what has happened to the judiciary. And if you look at Article 32 of the Constitution, what's Article 32 of the Constitution? It's called Constitutional Remedies. It's a part of Chapter 3, it's a part of fundamental rights. So if you look at habeas corpus, and the fact that habeas corpus has been suspended in so many states so often. If you look at states like Manipur, okay, Nagaland, Mizoram till 86, okay, Tripura till 2015, okay, Assam, the Assam crisis. So this is basically in terms of where the basic constitutional remedy is not been allowed. Or even if you look at now what's happened in Kashmir after August 5th. There has been a huge spate of habeas corpus petitions which are lying, which have not been dealt with. Why is the judiciary lethargic? Why is the judiciary becoming subservient to the political executive? Look at a lot of recent judgments. I was very surprised that one of the petitions which is taken up by a Supreme Court judge, which looks at a PIL, is looking at in terms of should Zoom be banned because of privacy and other issues. In terms of priority, is that a priority for the Supreme Court? And a lot of other human rights issues are pending and pending for years. If you look at the Vinayak case, the Supreme Court has been hearing this petition from 2014. So a lot of times in terms of this whole, when I say abdication, Supreme Court is something where a lot of us need to ask a lot of questions. A lot of judges, the 2017 right to privacy judgment is a remarkable judgment. Okay. And in that I also mentioned that they overturned the 1976 K.K. Shukla versus whatever ADM Jabalpur case judgment as well. The judges like that, and all those 9 judges, what are they doing? So we will need to ask these questions again in terms of that one. The next part, of course, is when we begin to give more importance to things like culture. When we start restricting freedoms in the name of culture. See, culture is extremely undefined. And often culture is a matter of convenience. What is culture? Is Kama Sutra part of our culture? It's an important book. It's very famous across many countries in the world. Are the temples of Khajuraho and Konark and other temples part of Indian culture? Then why are we becoming what I call puritanical? What is puritanical? Where we obsess with this whole thing about is it moral, is it right, we put restrictions on dress. So many universities have dress codes. Is dress code a priority for universities? Or are students thinking at all? Should that be a priority? Are our students reading at all? Should that be a priority? So a lot of times culture throws up priorities I think are misplaced. I don't know if Abdication, if Kshitij, who's on the group, remembers, we met a IS officer in our first field visit, Abhishek Krishna. And he was talking about Vidarbha and the work of people like Prakash Amte. And one of the things he said, that in India, if you provide for health and education, you become God. But he said the primary thing is we have failed in helping people find livelihoods. He said if you provide adequate livelihoods, they will figure out other questions. So some of these should be priority for all of us. What are we doing to ensure that the livelihoods which are decentralized, which empower local people? Because even if you look at, there's been mining happening in tribal regions since the last part of the 19th century. And when Tatars finished 100 years, there were articles which also talked about how the Tatars destroyed the local lac industry. Because lac industry was sustaining the tribal communities, and therefore they had no interest in working in the mines. So they destroyed all the trees which supported the lac insects. And the tribals had no option but to work in mines. So a lot of these are issues which we need to look at. What is the priority? And if you remember, and if you look at this whole issue of displacement of people because of development projects. And all the time people are displaced in the name of the nation, national interest. The question is, who's the nation? If you remember in 2011 when the whole, what should I say, that Lok Ayukta, what is that? That ombudsman thing was Anna Hazare and others. So Anna Hazare and the team called themselves civil society. They said we represent civil society. And at that time there was she's still active. There was this activist called Aruna Roy. She said, but aren't we also part of civil society? Why aren't we a part of this conversation? Somebody from South India and somebody from East India and somebody said, aren't we also part of civil society? Why aren't we also a part of civil society? So therefore this thing is very important for us to say, how do you define inclusive nation? And when we say nation, how do we show concern for all parts of the nation? That is something that's very important. And the last part, please forgive me today, I know I've been a little fast. Please raise that in questions, the things which are not clear. Because I wanted to cover a lot, because I know I've gone beyond what I normally keep for my talk. The last part I want to understand is that many of us don't want to engage with power. The middle class especially. We have a disdain for politics. We say politics is dirty. And it's very fashionable to say I'm not interested in politics. It's unfortunate. What is politics? Politics is public affairs. If you look at the origin of the word politics, what is politics? Politics is affairs of the polis. What is polis? Polis was a name for the socio-political order in Greece at a particular point of time. So politics affects all of us. And therefore, to say we are not interested in politics, we are doing disservice to each one of ourselves. We must be concerned. We must have a voice. We must contest, question, participate. Because a lot of us keep quiet. It's easy for some people to crush dissent. And I look at dissent, D-I-S-S-E-N-T. Dissent is, what is it? That where we are willing to question, criticize, challenge all kinds of opinions. And also, when we talk about dissent, I want all of you to understand a word called irreverence. Irreverence is not disrespect. Irreverence is unwillingness to treat somebody or something as sacred, or something we should revere. Irreverence is empowering ourselves to question everybody and every institution. You know, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this word holy cow. In many lectures of politics, I use the word holy cow. And many people are not familiar. I remember one year when I asked in class, what is a holy cow? And somebody said a cow which doesn't give milk. But I want to get back to that. What are holy cows? Institutions, ideas, and people which are supposed to be outside the realm of criticism. So in our educational institutions, we create holy cows. We can't question the institution's founder. We can't question a lot of people. There's need for scholarship to throw light on a lot of dark corners. There's a very interesting article I'll send to you in terms of, in the US now, they're attacking a lot of statues of people who are racist. And there's an article which I read, which I'll forward, which says that everybody, okay, was possibly racist at one time because of the culture of that time. Even Gandhi, who's respected, had elements of racism which are the part of his culture. But if Gandhi contributed to the larger good and didn't block progress, his racism should be seen as a human weakness and not something to reject all his ideas. So yes, every leader of ours will come short. Even somebody like Ambedkar, if you look at his writings on tribals, it's similar to the paternal attitude of upper caste towards Dalits. So all our leaders will have their blind spots. But please don't give up your rational critical inquiry. So I think I'll stop here. I apologize, I've taken too much time. So let's start with questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. If you have a question, write in the chat, I have a question, or type out your question, we'll read it for you. The first question for today is from Mahmood. What is your own definition of an Indian? That's the question.
Uh, my definition of an Indian is somebody who believes and respects in the Constitution, who believes and respects the values of the Constitution, and somebody who is from any geographical part of the country. So I need to have a definition, maybe I don't have the right words, for a pan-Indian identity. Something similar. Maybe the first person who talked about the need to have a pan-Indian identity was Tagore. Unfortunately, most of us don't read enough of Tagore. Tagore was the first one who was very critical of the kind of nationalism which Gandhi was a part of. He said, it's like you're riding a tiger. It turn around and devour you. So my idea of an Indian, yes, that a constitution is something which, it's in its inclusive nature, should be something which should define a space for every one of us. But anyone who's within the geographical limits of India is an Indian, and he is somebody who is also respects the constitution, I think that's an additional thing for me as an Indian. Maybe it's limited uh, since I've never really engaged with the question. I don't really have an adequate answer. Maybe I will work on an answer. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, sir. Next question, Akash wants to ask you a question.
Yes, Akash.
Yes, sir. So you said in 1967, competitive populism first showed its rose in India.
Yeah.
What led to the rise of competitive populism?
See, one is a lot of people say, if you look at in the 67 election, there was significant ideological bankruptcy. Okay. Most political parties didn't seem to have a political vision. So in 67, if you look at Ramano, Loya and everybody else, their only objective was to defeat the Congress. So anything which could be useful for that, they would use. Within the Congress, there was nobody of the intellectual stature of Nehru after that who could have some kind of ideological moorings. And therefore, most political parties did not have very strong ideologically centered leadership or somebody which believed really in democracy. So everybody was willing to do whatever it helped to win elections. And in the 67 elections was when identity politics first made its presence. I hope that answers.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question is from Priyanjali. Hasn't the judiciary been infiltrated over the last 4 decades by people placed there by larger socio-political syndicates?
See, to say yes is very easy, but I'm not sure whether that's really the truth. Because there are still voices within the judiciary. If you look at what happened in the judiciary, maybe in the last 2 years, remember, there were judges who called a press conference and said there's a crisis in judiciary. To say it's infiltrated is something we're also then generalizing. It's true that a lot of people who possibly see, I don't know whether it's infiltrated, because even if you look at judges who otherwise have given good judgments, sometimes for reasons of not wanting to confront the establishment, have not really taken a stand. So I don't know what is it exactly. Infiltration and all of this is, for me, too much of a generalization. Yes, there are over a period of time judges with certain kind of orientation, affiliation have been part of the system. Maybe all of that has happened, but I think it is a lot more bigger than it's just that infiltration. How many of you familiar with a recent judgment in the US Supreme Court during the coronavirus? So during the coronavirus, the US Supreme Court has said you cannot deny rights and facilities to people who may belong to the LGBTQ community. Why is this judgment important? Because the current judiciary has a majority of judges who are conservative. The last 2 judges who have been Trump nominees. But if you look at the judgment, large number of judges have also decided who have decided the judgment on constitutional principles. So yes, the establishment will want people, and this whole idea of committed judiciary in terms of was a term coined by Indira Gandhi. She didn't want judges who would challenge the government. Even at that time, a lot of people said judges' commitment is to the constitution, not to the government of the day. I think we need to have a little more nuanced understanding of judiciary. I'm not too comfortable with, though there is truth in what you say, but I don't know whether it's a complete truth. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next one is from Mohammed.
Yeah.
Mohammed, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I don't know till what extent I'm allowed to ask questions or not, because it's a huge topic. So, first thing is democracy in the terms of discourse. It is said that democracy is best amongst the worst. Right?
Yes?
Then democracy is best amongst the worst options.
Ah.
And then we have Francis Fukuyama who talks about the end of history and who says that now we have reached to a point in the history where it seems that liberal democracy and market capitalism is the reality of the world, and nothing can move beyond that. So don't you think it's a failure, collective failure of the scholarly community that we have not come up with an alternative to the democracy? That's number one.
Okay.
If I'm allowed to ask the second one, and it is with regard to, there is this very famous saying that we have the largest democracy, but I think there's this huge difference between India being a largest democracy and India being a largest electoral democracy. And this is where I want to pitch in P. Sainath, who says that democracy in India is confined to merely 10 to 15% of the population, and democracy has not really extended to the grassroots level. That's second. And thirdly, which is the last thing, I think, sir, when we talk about democracy, and democracy is basically a concept which is based on various, it's a set of various principles such as liberty, rights, equality. But according to me, the most tragic part of the story is the language of duty is missing from it. Although we have duties in the constitution to mention fundamental duties, but largely in democracy, if you look at in the Western world, the discourse of duty is missing from it. And I think my solution to the problem is we should look at unity not from the perspective of uniformity, as is the case, or is been promoted in India, through one rule of law, one nation, one language. I think we should learn to manage diversity by ensuring unity. Yes, sir, your comment.
Okay. So let me start answering the question. The first part of the question is, see, democracy is always an approximation of an ideal. Okay? The ideal is that there is popular control on power and various things associated with it. Right from John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was the first one who said that democracy, in spite of its flaws, is the best form of government because it has room for self-correction. Okay, so that's one part of what I want to establish, that any form of government will have problems. So the question is, how do you make democracy more participative, more accountable, more inclusive? So those are things which you will need to explore. That's the first part. Second part, when you talk about P. Sainath, what I want to answer is that P. Sainath belongs to a tradition of Marx. And Marx was the first one who called democracy a facade, something which is an appearance because the small minority still rules through the majority. But I also went back to Rousseau, who said that the will of the few is often projected as the will of all. So all human society and institutions will have issues because some sections want to have access power. To believe that workers, or to believe that the larger majority will be more inclusive, etc., is something which has been proved wrong by history. So if you look at the idea of Animal Farm, which is an interesting allegory, because Animal Farm was looking at what happened in Soviet Union and other places which claimed, or China, which claimed that finally, it is a classless society and all of that. When you mention people like Fukuyama, now Fukuyama as a thinker is a Hegelian, maybe Hegelian who subscribed to what we call liberal democracy. So the idea of end of history was Hegel's term for the perfect society. So to say that liberal democracy is a perfect and capitalism is perfect is wrong. We can never have a perfect society because there are multiple interests, and at all points of time, some interests will dominate over the others. So therefore, Fukuyama's thesis also is clearly problematic. So therefore, when you say democratic process, we can look at what's the best approximation we can achieve. And coming to the last part of your question in terms of duty, my problem is when you focus too much on duty. Yes, I would say that all of us should be responsible citizens. And if you're there in the first lecture, what I started off by saying, what Aristotle said, we must all be capable of ruling and being ruled. So being ruled is where each one of us obeys the rule of law. Each one of us fulfills our responsibility. often when you emphasize duty, then people tend to take away rights. Okay. And a lot of imposition of should. I believe that all of us have to be more responsible. Every citizen, everybody must be responsible for their vote, for their being a citizen. But personally, and this is my personal opinion, we have, like our parents and colleges have emphasized duty over rights, have emphasized duty over transparency, have emphasized duty over respect for everyone. So that is my problem. Maybe I may be wrong, but this is how I look at it. Yeah. Since we have little time, I have tried to briefly answer all 4 questions. I hope it's okay with you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Next question is from Christine. I have always wanted to reach a position in my career that impacts policy changes, but there is this fear of being in the midst of powerful people and possibly being influenced by it in the wrong way. What would your advice be to the young professionals who have a similar fear like this?
Yeah, the most important thing is there will be no realm where there is no politics or power. You go to an organization, okay? Every organization will have its own power structures, power equations, undercurrents of power. So even to be a successful professional, you will need to understand how to manage power. This is something which is a given. If you don't want to manage power, you will not really make even reach positions of responsibility of decision making within your own organization. I'm not saying be manipulative. Politics is not always manipulative. So the first thing is that none of us can actually run away from power. We need to figure out how to manage power. Okay? So we need to empower ourselves. So if you want to be a matter of influence, you must have personal power to offset the power of other people. So personally empowering is the first thing. Second is understand how power works. Where is the real power in an organization? Where's the real? So build your networks. Okay. Build better lines of communication. Okay. If you can, in terms of, so that's important. Okay. And also in terms of how can you be, so therefore that is, so if you don't want to be influenced by powerful people, become empowered. So empowering is a very important step for anybody. Because all of us can be dominated by powerful people in our lives, at homes, in universities and colleges. It's empowerment. Okay, so that's important. And then figure out how you will be a player without sacrificing morality, sacrificing scruples. So find mentors, find people who can help you contribute. Okay? And there'll be such people in politics across parties, across processes. That's my answer. I don't know whether it satisfies. Yeah.
Yes. So there's one more question from Christine. Could you recommend writers or books that have influenced LGBT plus rights on a national level?
See, there's a lot of literature under what comes under queer literature. Offhand, it's difficult for me to remember names of people. I'm sure there are other people who will be able to help you better. But there will be, I mean, there are lawyers who have fought on gender issues who possibly have influenced policy. This is something which offhand I can't remember. Maybe I will find out and I'll let you know. Yeah.
Question from Abhishek. In the case of Dreyfus Affair, the writer Emile Zola stoked a movement in his support with his open letter, I accuse. Do you think writers today have the power to stoke such a public movement? Are popular media of today, like TV and internet, suitable for an intellectual and sophisticated defense the oppressed?
See, I mentioned this book called The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh. Read the book because there he takes issue with writers for not really engaging with current issues, whether it's environmental or political. Okay. How many of you are familiar with a playwright and a person called Václav Havel? Vaclav Havel. He was from Czechoslovakia. Okay. Please read his works, read his contribution, because he was a very important political voice and a leader in post-communist Czechoslovakia. So there are, there will be, I think writers, intellectuals are very important. If you look at Mumbai city, if you look at the social reform movement, it was people who wrote, intellectuals who pushed us to change. Look at Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra, or look at the whole Pratna Samaj movement. Okay. Look at Pandita Ramabai. There is a word which I really like. The word is called feisty, F-E-I-S-T-Y. F-E-I-S-T-Y. Somebody who's not browbeaten, somebody who's a lot of josh, a lot of energy, who will not take anything lying down. We need all of you young people to be really feisty, to be able to rise up to people who can bully you. And one more thing is in terms of Edward de Bono. He's written a book called The Yellow Book. In that he says, be very careful of people who speak well. He said they'll fry your brains before you realize it. So extremely articulate people, we must keep our antenna up. That means people like me, I think I'm articulate. I'm very persuasive sometimes. So I can influence. So you need to keep your question antenna open to question things which I say or anybody says. So that's very important. Yes, I think, and I talked about Arun Tikekar yesterday. He's written a book called The De-Intellectualizing of Mumbai. He feels that intellectuals have abdicated their responsibility in Mumbai, in Maharashtra politics. Okay. So there are intellectuals have played a very important role. Okay. And maybe we need to have a lot of you who are emerging intellectuals and writers play a greater role, because if you can influence with better quality writing, more persuasive arguments, yes, there's so much you can do. Yeah.
Andesha wants you to elaborate a little more on constitutionalism is more than constitution.
If you look at the first amendment of the Indian Constitution, which among other things put restrictions on freedom of expression, this was the first assault on constitutionalism. Because constitutionalism is something which is there to restrict power and safeguard rights. Any amendments which enhances government power and reduces rights is against constitutionalism. Okay. That's the first thing which I want to say. Second thing, when you say constitutionalism, Indian leaders right from Nehru have failed, right from people in the Constituent Assembly, when they failed to eliminate laws like sedition laws. England itself has cancelled sedition law. So we have carried on laws like Official Secrets Act, sedition law, which are basically against our people, so that we couldn't question the British. Now our leaders are using those same laws to prevent us from questioning them. So constitutionalism is where we continued with a lot of colonial era laws, even section 377 of the IPC, okay, which was struck down recently. So all of that is a problem. So we need to, so all of us need to study, as I said, please time with the preamble. Please spend time with some of the Constitutional Assembly debates. Understand this, the principle of law. And also where Mohammed talks about, he said, we should not talk. That's why I said, I'm not talking about unity at all. That's why I said, how do you have an inclusive India? That's why I talked about fraternity, which is there. How do you develop, how do you build bridges across ethnicities, languages, religions. So my generation has failed all of you. You know, somebody said that my generation should pay reparations to all of you. What is reparation? Compensation. Because we failed you in environment issues, we failed you in political issues, we failed you in so many issues. So maybe all of you should have a movement to make us pay. That's very important. And when I say accountability, you know, look at Mumbai University. We're one of the oldest universities. For the past 20 years, there are no student body elections. Okay. And I think in 2007, there was a committee set up by Mr. Lingdo, who was the chief election commissioner, who recommended that the Mumbai University should have elections again. We're talking about 13 years. So we as teachers, as academic leaders have failed all of you. You know, one of the questions, I hope some of you fight for it. You know, that if you don't get quality education, should colleges and universities give refund? Please think about it. You should ask for a refund if you haven't made you think. If you're dishing out poor quality education. If you say that education is a service, maybe you should ask for a refund. Think about it. You know, I said this once in a teacher's refresher course. And one teacher said the Mumbai University will go bankrupt if they have to give refund. And other teachers were very offended. They said, what is it? We are encouraging irresponsible behavior. But accountability is important. Yeah, I hope I've answered your innovation. I tend to digress. Sorry.
Question from Ajay Kumar. You say that a lot of the ideology of Mr. Gandhi was in the human interest, but how can you say so to someone who is extremely influenced by Brahminical ideology and casteist? I think Brahminical ideology is against the human interest.
No, what I said was, I am not supporting Gandhi. I have a lot of problems with Gandhi. My point is that we cannot judge people from today's understanding. Okay? All of us will definitely be what I call products of our conditioning. Okay? It is ideal to respect people who can rise above that consideration, and some people do. If you remember Ambedkar burning the Manusmriti in Mahad, who was a Brahmin who joined him? The Brahmin called Sahasra Buddhe. Okay. So there are people who will be able to get out of their conditioning and Brahminical thing, and that's why somebody like Phule is somebody who said he was okay, when he talked about the non-Brahmin movement. So when you talk about Brahminical, you can have Brahminical. Well, Brahminical is basically elite. It's a ideology of the elites. You know, if you look at all founders of religion, whether Mahavira, Buddha, Christ, Prophet Muhammad, all of them, their religion was definitely very radical. But over a period of time, we have removed the radicalism of the religion. You know, I read many years ago, there was many years ago, one bishop said, okay, wherever Jesus Christ went, he sowed discord within the establishment. He challenged the establishment. He said, wherever I go as a bishop, people offer me tea. I become a part of the establishment. Okay. So that's true. So when you talk about, if you look at Islam was the first egalitarian religion because everybody prayed together, first congregational thing where there was no difference between anybody. Everybody will be at the same level. Buddhism also, in terms of, had a lot of egalitarian thing on the basis of compassion. But even Buddhism and Jainism was definitely anti-women because it was subject to the ideas of that time. So there will be always blind spots in all systems of thought. So therefore, when Rousseau says So most religious institutions have completely focused more on rituals and practices rather than the radical um, message of religion. And that's why what happened in South America in the 1960s onwards, called liberation theology. Liberation theology is the fusing of Marx and religion. It's happened if you look at Swami Agnivesh in India. He's somebody who believes that the radical vision of religion of Hinduism also means fighting against all kinds of oppression. So those are voices. Please find out about them.
Yeah. Before we move on to the next question, is there anyone on the group who is not able to join the WhatsApp group? You can just unmute yourself and let us know right now. Not if you have not tried, but you're unable to join the WhatsApp group. Okay, so Omkar, you can ask your question.
Afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Yeah.
Sir, in the course of your talk, you mentioned about multi-ethnic democracy, and this reminds me of Dr. Ambedkar saying in Constituent Assembly that we are different warring camps, and himself being a leader of a warring camp. Sir, 70 odd years down the line, no matter how much ever we deny, we are still different warring camps. Not uniformly, but a huge part of our society or our nation, we are still striving with this idea of warring camps. So in line with this, sir, there is this present discourse which is... Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, sir. So in line with this thing, there's this present discourse which is being put up by the present ideology which is in power, I'll say. They generally, put up this idea that we need a uniform norms, we need some uniform norms of nationalism. I totally agree to this, I totally want to clear here that uniformization for me does not mean saffronization. But still, where do we as a nation to go ahead, where do we set those uniform or maybe constant ideals of nationalism for us to move in the right direction?
See, the first thing, why does nationalism has to be one? Nationalism is if I respect my nation in terms of all its differences and pluralism. When I say uniform, you are denying pluralism. Our ways of looking at reality are definitely going to be different. You can't force everyone to think in a certain way. Culturally, we are so different. Ethnically, we are so different. And this movement towards uniformity is not necessary. The nation can be together with multiple voices, multiple ways of looking at it. I may profess anything, but if I am working for the well-being of the entire nation, okay, I am somebody who is definitely being nation. So when you talk about warring camps, one of the things that I want to talk about is in India, political change has not happened along with social change. If you look at some countries in Europe, social change preceded political change. Okay. So egalitarianism, etc., became before people became a democracy. In India, our thinking is still defined by identities and hierarchies. So there's a need to change a lot of that. Because that's something which we need to understand, that we don't have a democratic ethos. What's a democratic ethos? Democratic ethos is respect for pluralism. Respect for the rights of all sections, irrespective of where they come from. These two things are very important. And we keep denying rights on various grounds. And uniformity is dangerous. Because no human being is infallible. All of us are fallible. So any ideology which promotes a single definition of Indianness, single uniformity, is doomed to failure. Because all of us have become a part of India, we have traveled different pathways. Whether it's a language, whether it's our ideas. Okay. Even if you look at the number of versions of the Ramayana across India, read Ambedkar's Riddles of Hinduism. And all those things are important for us because liberation happens through that. Because all of us as Indians, we have suppressed women, we have suppressed people who are LGBTQ. It's a part of who we've been. And the moment we say uniformity, we will deprive so many others of their rights. So that's something which I have an issue with. That I don't believe in uniformity, unity. Nation does not mean all of us thinking alike. Nation means respecting each other and ensuring all of us are there together for a common well-being. Okay, that's my understanding of nation. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Abhishek Vedate has put a feedback form and a link to the WhatsApp group on the chat. If you have any questions, you can also put the question on the form so that we can address them later. Nosheen, you can ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
So, sir, there's a concept called as a power paradox. So it says that empathy and social intelligence are the ones that are important for acquiring power, but these are the ones that actually go in the first place when you actually acquire a position or you are in the position of power. So, when you spoke about Machiavelli and his entire concept of end justify the means, how in the case of Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar is it justified? And I was thinking if it's possible to be a good person and a good politician at the same time, or can it be possible for the same?
Okay. We need to clarify. Machiavelli didn't say ends justify the means. What Machiavelli said, the state to achieve its objectives should use the necessary means to achieve it. If you read Machiavelli carefully, and one of the reasons why he wanted a strong state was because there should be social morality. So you were somebody who said that social morality is very important. Okay, so let's not misquote poor Machiavelli. Is a nice guy, so let's move from that. The point you made is extremely valid. One, what is empathy? Understand how minds work, understand how people think, and in terms of the ability to influence, they are very important to acquire power. Okay? But if you look at power, what Foucault says, okay, he says that politics is war by other means. So if some people has come to power and is trying to impose, the other people are resisting, and therefore they're acquiring knowledge to resist this. So therefore, in politics, there can always be this. Second, in terms of when you say you're a good politician, is your moral compass in the right place? Are you somebody who stands for certain values and principles, and you will say you will not move beyond it? Okay. Then in that sense, it's possible for you to be a good politician and a good human being. A lot of good people at one point of time like the trappings of power, and then they are willing to give up. That's the problem. I don't know how many of you are familiar with somebody called Madhu Dandavati. He's a politician from Maharashtra. Some of his politics was problematic, okay, in the sense that seen as a polarizing influence. But he was somebody who was early in the Congress, quit, became a part of the Janata government. When the Janata government collapsed under his own contradictions, he quit politics. He said, I joined the Janata Party to give new politics. And I realized that all of us are still hungry for power, we are greedy, we are self-centered. So he said that I didn't want to be a part of such politics. Then he moved on to doing social change issues. So therefore, people are making choices. If you're looking at somebody like Nelson Mandela, a lot of people have problems with his political stance, but he was somebody very clear. He came to power, he could have continued because he was so popular. But he said, I'll be there for only one term. So there are ways in which you can put restrictions on personal ambition and not make compromises. All that is possible. That's a serious problem with the Burmese leader Aung San Suu Kyi. So that's a problem. So it is still possible. I believe it is. And I'm sure there are politicians who are across the world. And when you read Václav Havel, maybe you will get some answers. There may be lots of other such examples, India and elsewhere.
Yeah, is Siraj there? Siraj, are you there? Okay, so we'll just move on to the next question. Should there be an expiry date of a constitution in this changing world? The question is from Prabhav Chaturvedi. Should there be an expiry date of a constitution in this changing world? If yes, then what should be the time period? As said by you, constitution amendments are assault on constitution. Do you feel it is a viable option?
Let me correct 2-3 things. I talked about ordinances because amendments have to go through the parliament. So therefore, there is a slight misunderstanding in your question. So therefore, I want to clear that. Even people like Zimbland and others says, constitutions are established at the point of time. And it's possible that they are not able to respond to current challenges. So therefore, constitutions should find ways, or the political process should find ways in which these new challenges are addressed and changed. Second thing about, do constitutions come with an expiry date? I don't know. Why? Because a constitution is not ironclad law. The constitution is broad principles to restrain power and to safeguard rights. And these broad principles are seen as valid even today. So constitutional values and principles to a large extent may be valid for a long time. So if you look at the American Constitution, it is more than 250 years old, and therefore it is still valid. So therefore, in that sense, yes, it will need to change, it will need to adapt. And that's the purpose of amendments. So if you look at the American Constitution, I don't remember the number of the Constitution. If you look at 42 or 44, I think, when Roosevelt became president for the 4th term, Franklin Roosevelt became the president, the lawmakers said, it is not good for somebody to be in power for so long. The parliament was amended to say that an American president can have a maximum of 2 terms. This is what we call where the constitution amends itself, keeping in line with essential values of safeguarding what we call institutionalization of power. That power, the exercise of power is managed with sufficient restrictions. Okay. Every constitution adapt, like our constitution has, if you look at the 73rd and 74th Amendment, in spite of limitations, they have expanded participative democracy by having better quality local self-governing institutions. So constitutions can adapt. The only problem is if you want to have a new constitution, that constitution that constituent assembly must be truly inclusive, which is a challenge. Because even if you look at the constituent assembly, earlier constituent assembly, some people said there was not sufficient representation for tribals. There was not sufficient representation for women. Okay. Not sufficient representation for certain minority groups. So all of that will be concerns. Because at the moment, our constitution, in spite of weaknesses, I feel, is still the best institutional safeguard for a plural country like ours. This is my personal belief. Yeah. I can't hear you. Hello.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah.
So should we continue or should we address the questions in the evening? We have 2 more
How many
questions.
questions are there?
2.
2
questions, yes.
Yeah, then I'll take them up. No?
Yeah, so Omkar, you can ask your question.
Sir, while you were talking about populism, in my contemplation of Indian politics, my limited understanding of Indian politics so far, electoral politics has been one of the biggest flaws of our political system. So, if you could please suggest some ways, or in your understanding, what are the ways in which we can overcome the flaws of this electoral politics in our country?
No, see, I said 2 things. One is first, how do you work towards establishing a democratic ethos? What's a democratic ethos? Where we empower everybody. So everybody has a voice, everybody is willing to speak up, everybody is willing to stand up. Okay, that's one. Second is in terms of how do we ensure that the political efficacy is improved? How do you ensure that more people are aware about the political process, that more people are willing to take a stand? So we need to increase political participation. And therefore, what Hannah Arendt said, can we recover analytical thinking in political process? Can we develop analytical thinking in political process? Can all of us become more analytical? Can we question our own assumptions, our own biases? Can we look at something which will be in the broader interest of all sections of the people? When we redefine a lot of our understanding, that can happen. Because when you say democratic politics, yes, it's flawed. Whether we need to look at something like proportional representation or there are other ways, that we'll have to explore. That's why right from the first day I'm saying, if all of us can use our imagination to read up enough, I'm not saying come up with off-the-cuff ideas, something which is workable, something which is in line with principles, something which is practical. I somehow seem to be remembering De Bono quite a lot today. Now, De Bono made a difference, made a very significant difference between creativity and crazitivity. He said crazitivity is being different for the sake of being different. Creativity is new ideas which help solve the problem. So if our problem solving is going to create new problems and new conflicts, then it's not, it is more gimmicks. So let us understand the problem fully. Let us understand, let us talk to lots of people who are different from us. See, for me, the Constituent Assembly, in spite of its weaknesses, has such a large variety of voices. And I must appreciate the statesmanship of all the leaders of the Constituent Assembly, that even though Ambedkar didn't get elected, not only was he made a member of the Constituent Assembly, he was made the chairman of the drafting committee. That's amazing vision of inclusion. Yes, it has its weaknesses, it has its flaws, but every human institution will have flaws. There will be never a time when we will have perfect. And please don't ever believe that any human being can have the right answers. All of us are fallible, all of us can make huge mistakes, and we need to understand that. Yeah.
Suraj, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah. Your question was unclear. Can you please ask yourself?
Yes. Hello.
हाँ.
Yes, Siraj.
You're audible.
सर मुझे पूछना था 15th जून को जो
I can't hear you. Hello?
जी इस बारे में कुछ 1967 में या 1962 में कुछ एग्रीमेंट था क्या?
No. Well, please repeat your question. I couldn't hear the first part of your question. Please
Siraj?
repeat the full question.
Hello?
Siraj, I can't hear your full question. Please repeat your full question.
सर 15 जून को जो इंडियन आर्मी और चाइनीज आर्मी में जंग हुई उसमें वेपन्स क्यों नहीं यूज किए और इस बारे में कुछ एग्रीमेंट हुआ था क्या 1962 में या 1967 में?
Okay. See, the first thing is, if you look at the 62 war, okay, after the war, though the territory is disputed, we have accepted something, we accepted the claims of both countries. Okay. So, when you say the line of actual control is different, India claims the Pak occupied Kashmir is ours, Pakistan claims the Indian occupied Kashmir is theirs, and therefore it's a temporary border. So, line of actual control is more or less permanent. In the sense, still we reach an agreement for final settlement of individual claims on both sides, because we have some claims on western sector, they have some claims on the eastern sector, and therefore those claims have to be settled. If you look at the terrain in Ladakh, okay, it is flat terrain with very little landmarks. So the line of actual control in many places, even in Arunachal Pradesh near Bumla, which is a pass, is not easily defined, and therefore these are approximations. And since these are approximations, there will always be soldiers which will cross those lines from both sides, and therefore to reduce confrontation, okay, as far as possible, soldiers should not carry too much of these weapons. Those are agreements to reduce conflict. Okay, so that is something which is there. So that is a mutual agreement, so that in future there is no unnecessary conflict. Because if you look at the terrain, it's very difficult to say. And like if you look at Pangong Lake, Pangong Lake is about 33% India, 67% in China. How do you know exactly where that line is? Difficult to say. No? So a lot of these are conventions and agreement. Whether it is a hardcore written agreement is difficult to say. It's more we have agreed that we'll try and de-escalate. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
This was the last question for today. So we come to an end of this session. The next session is today evening itself at 6:30 p.m. So hope to see you all there.